off to a great start. I'm Alistair Upton, I'm Chief Executive Creative Folkestone, and it's my huge pleasure to introduce the acclaimed artist, Royal Academician, Bob and Roberta Smith, who is going to talk to you at this evening's salon. The format was going to be that he talks and then takes questions, but he's decided to go table to table and do a very intimate event. I'm sorry that isn't actually going to happen. We're going back to, no, because he did say it was, but I think he was joking. We're back to the ordinary format, which is he's going to speak, and then we're going to open it up. It's an informal evening, round tables. I saw that Lee Pennington last week introduced the salons and explained the history of them, which I was completely, to my shame, unaware of that they were set up. I knew that they were hosted in houses by women, but I didn't understand that it was because of the fact that at that point it was difficult for women to get into academic spaces, so that they were set up as a place to discuss art and culture and science and so on. So it's a great tradition, and Liv remains the hostess for this evening, and we'll be doing questions, etc. afterwards, and has pulled the program together. Bob and Roberta Smith came to Folkestone in 2017 with his piece, Folkestone is an Art School, and that has been brought again to the 2021 Triennial because it remains relevant to the things we're looking at. And in a sense, it's never been away as a piece. And I don't mean that physically, because it remains at the station as a provocation, but it's not the physicality, it's the provocation behind it, the thoughts behind it. Certainly we at Creative Folkestone spend a good deal of time thinking about it and discussing it, and where does it fit with what we're trying to do. And so it has resonated very strongly through that period. And so it's going to be very interesting for me personally to listen tonight. I hope it is for you as well. I've always found it's got a huge energy, sometimes enigmatic, but certainly I know it's a very powerful piece that has a positive effect on the town. So it's really brilliant that Bob and Roberta Smith is here this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that introduction, Alistair. It might be good to turn the lights down a little bit, because I'm not sure, looking at these slides, whether they're a bit bleached out. But anyway, I will persist. So what I'm going to do is thank everybody for coming, and thanks for being invited back. When I did Folkestone is an art school, although it is part of the programme this year, I never really talked about it very much. We did it, which was a lot of effort, and in fact there are a few people here who were involved in it, two of the fantastic students, and one of the people who really helped make it happen on the ground. But I never really discussed it and talked about it. And I don't know that I'm really going to discuss it and talk about it now. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to end the talk with it. But I'm going to show you some more recent works from this summer to begin with. And then I'm going to sort of leap back in time and then percolate through some of the ideas which were resonating with me when I devised the Folkestone as an Art School program, if you like. But this is much more recently. This is just before COVID, or during COVID, and it's some banners that I've made. You know, I haven't actually stitched these banners together. I've painted them, and then a friend of mine, Elizabeth Cake, has made up these beautiful banners. And they are, you know, they're kind of political kind of banners. But this banner is important because it says, "Help Art Save Lives." And it's part of a project, again, that when I jump back in time, you'll see what some of the thinking is. So a lot of my activity over the last 10 years has been about arts advocacy, if you like, via making art. but it's also, right, this is, it's good I can't see you now. I'm not so, not so fazed by it all. But it's also been about thinking about the arts as a kind of human right. And so this idea of Help Art Save Lives is a project which is now currently, there's an exhibition in the Attenborough Centre in Leicester where we're getting kids to make art, and then in local schools, and then the parents of those children are making a donation directly to a life-saving charity. They get the art, and the charity gets the money, and we're trying to do a grassroots campaign which is building, I hope, into being a kind of art aid. We have do something funny for money and Macmillan coffee mornings and all of these kinds of activities. But the point about it is it relates to the arts advocacy in a way, because when you're during this project, when children are asked why they're making art in schools, they'll be able to usefully reply, because I am saving a life. This is a project which was in Chatham earlier in the summer, and it was commissioned by Cement Fields, part of the Estuary Festival. And I asked my son, who will crop up in this talk a little bit, when he was 4 years old, I caught him making a drawing, and he was making a loop and then running the line through the loop and then onto the next loop. And I said to him, wow, Fergal, that's amazing. That's an algorithm. The French would call it a derive. It's a recipe. It's an instruction. He said, if you like that, Dad, you'll like this. And he was drawing lines that ran to the end of the page, then bounced off to the other side of the page, then bounced across. And I was just gobsmacked by him. And now this was a while ago, now he's studying to be an architect at the Bartlett. So I asked Fergal to devise a loop, and because he's really into making models, he made a model of a sort of structure which you can see is a loop. And I asked him to make it to the scale of these Britons lead figures that I had kicking around since I was a child. And this summer, we were able to build this structure, and it went to it went to Chatham. There's Fergal, and I've got a whole jacket with this fantastic design on it. Art is your human right, and there's Fergal drawing on his structure, and there are the helpers, if you like, including Sue Jones, who runs Cement Fields, standing on the structure after it being completely smothered in people's drawings. And it was, it was a kind of, you can see the references, if you like, between ideas about Folkestone being an art school, or creating this structure for the public to come and do their thing on. And this idea, in a way, of kind of collaborating with people, trying to work with people, trying to take on board everyone's creativity. I mean, it's one of my, I don't think it's a controversial contention, but, obviously for me, I think of myself as an artist, but I don't really think of myself as an exalted human being. Creativity is something, everybody can pick up a pencil and draw. And so this kind of idea about trying to think about everybody's creative ambitions, if you like, and trying to do it in a serious way, not relegate it to an activity that just happens outside of a main program or something, but to try and embrace it and push it right in front of centre of one's activity. So this is a project at Thamesmead, and I've made, this is what kept me going during COVID, really. You can't really see it in any of these photographs, but there's a long painting that's 24 metres long, where I have interviewed quite a lot of the people in this crowd and transcribed my conversations with them into this long painting, which is called the Thamesmead Codex. And this was an event where we animated the Thamesmead Codex with some of those people, but then also some actors where they read the Thamesmead Codex. And so you can see it more clearly here. It has some conventional paintings in it. I went back to making paintings of images of Thamesmead, actually. But you can see these stories on these panels. So that's what I was doing during COVID. I was sitting in a little room at the top of my house in London with these metre-square panels, interviewing people over the phone, and then transcribing the interviews, and then editing, cutting them down, making them so that they were, about a particular kind of aspect of their story, and then we exhibited these. In fact, the man at the front here in the mask is an artist called Joshua Uvigera, who, one of the other things I've done this summer is work with the amazing Yinka Shonobari on the summer exhibition, and he's totally stuck a stick of gelignite underneath that rather moribund institution, invited a whole new group of people into it, and he allowed me to invite Joshua Uvigera, who grew up on the Thamesmead estate and was part of this project, and he has a huge painting, a massive painting in the room that I've curated. And the other day I went in and it had a red dot on it. So it's really, really fantastic. So in a weird way, with Joshua, it's this kind of thing about how you delve into the mix of what art is, to do things with it. So this is a painting of a lot of the pages from a book that I wrote in the period just before COVID, which was called You Are an Artist, and it has within it this idea that teaching is beautiful. And then that is the real Roberta. So I'm standing there, but there is actually a Roberta. She's slightly a figment of my imagination, but she actually exists. And she studied fine art at Kingston School of Art. She's about 5 years older than me. And then retrained to become a group psychoanalyst. And so this idea of somehow we have these conversations about collaboration and art and what you can do with it. And she's been a really marvelous person throughout my life, although not actually been somebody who's been making stuff. All this stuff I'm showing you I've actually made, but she does sort of exist, and there we are outside the Harris Museum in Preston from a show which closed on Sunday. But in that show, we had these banners again. You see the banners, and then we had various different pieces that people could interact with. They could hold these placards with slogans on. This is a group of teachers who came in on the opening night and just animated the space so brilliantly by holding a kind of their own kind of protest. And then this is leaping back a little bit. So this is me in the National Art Education Archive, which is in Bretton Hall. It's actually in Yorkshire Sculpture Park. Yorkshire Sculpture Park was Bretton Hall, and which was a great educational institute. But I'm in there and looking through the National Art Education Archive, which is full of a history of different artistic educational initiatives which have been launched. I think it goes back to the days of Sir Joshua Reynolds and the formation of the Royal Academy. And I was asked to make an exhibition really celebrating 30 years of the establishment of this archive. And it coincided with also a commission in the park to make a public sculpture. So, there are all sorts of things that I could rabbit on about, wormhole kind of stories and anecdotes, but one of my big things was living in America at the end of the 80s and traveling across it and seeing these big road signs. That's been one of the key influences on me, in a way. Small businesses advertising with enormous signs that you've just crossed the border and you're going to eat some fantastic nachos or something. So I wanted to do something like that. So this whole project was called Art Makes Children Powerful. And then I made a series of sculptures which were in the Bothy galleries, which are small galleries in the northern part of the sculpture park. And the challenge was to go through the archive and try and bring out some of the key stories of it. And so I thought to do that, I needed to make some interpretive sculptures. So they're sculptures of the key figures of art education with their stories written around them. So this is Sir Joshua Reynolds. I've captured his Enlightenment ringlets with the samovar, and I've got his sunglasses. And it says this is Sir Joshua Reynolds on it in 1768. You know, Reynolds set up the Royal Academy, and the whole thing about it was that it was the Google of its day, essentially. You know, we had the Grand Tour, but at the Royal Academy, the students didn't need to do that because they had all the casts of Greco-Roman sculpture there, and then they had all the prints made of the Sistine Chapel ceiling and various other Renaissance masterpieces. So the British art student was being given a kind of entry into European Renaissance art, much as a kind of copy of what the French were doing in the French Academy. And so Reynolds and the artists of the day were key in kind of opening this sort of story up. Oh dear, what's going to happen now? This will give me also, while I do this, it'll also give me, oh, here we go. No, we're on to the next one. I won't go into another anecdote. But so this was rather lovely. Oh, the case in which these two sculptures are sitting on was decorated by a woman called, this is Marion Richardson, who's the sculptor in the far back. And she publicised the art of the chap who's got the Bakelite radio for his head, is Franz Cizek. And Franz Cizek is the reason why kids in school do lino cutting. He was a woodblock printer at the turn of the century, making woodblocks. He had children. His studio's been refurbished with this new product called linoleum. He didn't want his kids carving into his expensive woodblocks, so he said to the kids, why don't you carve into these offcuts of linoleum? And then he printed them, and then it began a whole technological revolution, really, an educational revolution, where he worked with children developing lino cuts. This was part of something which he called the child art revolution, which after the First World War then became an important, you know, with the birth of Freud and Jung and all those, that kind of thinking, Steiner, it became part of that story about trying to think about creativity as the antidote to all the destruction that had happened in the First World War. So this idea of the child art movement then was picked up by Marion Richardson in the 1920s, who was a kind of Bloomsburyite educator. And she pushed that idea up until the 1930s in Britain. So this idea of the child art movement became a kind of a Bloomsbury kind of enterprise, if you like, led by Marion Richardson, and that cupboard was decorated by her and her school in part of that effort. And then around that, the walls are some of his wood blocks. So there's Franz Cizek. They all have radios and TVs for heads because I see them all as broadcasters on some level. Oh, left on a bit there, have I? No, that's good. No, so this is A.E. Halliwell. And A.E. Halliwell has a sort of nice 30s radio for her head. And A. Halliwell designed all these wonderful wartime posters. The Dig for Victory poster, which you can see in the back there, was one of his. These beautiful, the originals, this is a wonderful archive. The original gouaches are all in there. And A. Halliwell set up the first industrial design course in Camberwell School of Art in the 1930s. It might be easier if I do say next. Have we got somebody up there? Can we just have the next slide, please? Forward, please. Okay. I'm just going to say next, actually. I'm going to dispense with that. So this is Don Pavey. And Don Pavey, this is after the Second World War. Don Pavey is a kind of 60s kind of maverick educator, really interesting guy. He was actually at art school with my parents in Ambleside, the Royal College. But he was into game theory, and he had, in that archive, there's an enormous collection of his children's games, but then he was also into networks and ideas about colour. So he really, people like Don Pavey in art education in the 1960s and late 1950s, really, they were part of the evolution of the mobile phone that we have in our pocket. I mean, he really saw into the future and saw the importance of visuality in all of our lives and teaching it to kids, and also thinking about it as a serious intellectual neural network kind of activity. So and in around there are very different examples of his kind of teachings. Next slide, please. So there's Don Pavey again. This is a key thing, actually. There are two drawings of fireworks there. There were lots of these firework paintings in that archive. The wonderful thing about those firework art paintings is that this was a kind of high point of art education in schools. And it's really, this is the art education that I absorbed. So you would go into the school and you'd be saying, they would say, right, we're going to paint fireworks today. You're going to paint the grass, and let's try and go for the sky. So you would do that one week, and then the next week you say, well, paint your parents' family on one side, paint your mother's family on one side, your father's on the other side. So you would sort of begin to do that, and then we're going to paint the fireworks the following week. So this image of these fireworks, you can see they've kind of incrementally grown over the weeks, and they've been that child's, this is where we've gone wrong with our education in some level, they've been that child's individual view. No one child could have made the next child's artwork. Let's go on to the next slide. This is Tom Hudson. So Tom Hudson, you can see him in the back there, and he with the whole, my mind's going a bit dead now, but Tom Hudson was key in inventing the foundation course. It kicked off in Scarborough in 1956 with some summer schools, and this idea, I mean, really, it was a bit late in the day because really he was stealing all the ideas of the Bauhaus and just dragging it into British art education in 1956. But they came up with this idea of a diagnostic course that the kids would do so they could find out which branch of the arts or graphics or whatever it was that they were going to do. So he's a key figure in it. And there were lots of... He then went on to live in Canada, and he made TV programs, and they produced lots of materials for his TV programs. They were quite funny materials. Let's have the next slide. Where he's, in the images in the back there, you can see him, there would be a rostrum camera, and it would be showing you how to draw a cubistic glass, and you would start by, drawing the side of the glass and then looking at it from the top and then drawing a circle on the top. It was all quite formulaic. But you can see that, he is an absolute key figure in art education. So let's have the next slide. So there's a bit more of that room. And let's have the next one. speeding up a bit. Now let's have the next slide. Yes, so this is Kenneth Baker. Now, Kenneth Baker fucked up art education in a big way, because up until Kenneth Baker's time, kids in school were developing their own visions, their own poetic visions, built out of this idea of the child art movement. So the whole force of child art in schools was all about the development of the individual, the development of the child, so that obviously it wasn't terribly successful because there was a Second World War, but the whole idea was that it's the development of the self, to find the child's voice. Kenneth Baker was rather like Michael Gove. He wanted rid of art education and the commitment for all schools to teach art education in secondary schools, but he was persuaded that they could keep it if it was made rigorous. And rigorous meant exemplars. So that meant that you suddenly had to look at the art of the past and make something a bit like it. You had to learn from those artists who had gone before and make something that showed that you knew something about art history and technique. And hey presto, if it looked a bit like Vincent van Gogh or something, you would be away. And it led to me, actually, this part of the reason for advocating the arts in schools was led not only by Michael Gove, but my own son, again, Fergal. He came back from school one day and he had made a really great portrait of Vincent van Gogh. And he said, "Today we've been looking at self-portraits, Dad." And I said, "I don't think you have, actually, because it doesn't look like you." But you can see in that, you can mark it. You can say, well, it looks a bit like Vincent van Gogh. There's lots of impasto, lovely colour. But that's not the point, It's not how Vincent van Gogh conceived of the making of that image. So it was really Kenneth Baker, who is a rather benign conservative figure now, but he really fucked up art education. Let's have the next slide. Sorry to use that hard language. Next slide. Now we come to the present day, if you like. This is a sculpture of Leslie Butterworth, who's who she's not now, but then she was the president of the National Society for Educators in Art and Design. Really wonderful organisation trying to give teachers support in schools and producing magazines full of fantastic ideas. Of course, if you're teaching art in a primary school, but you're not somebody who went to art school or that confident in the arts, where do you go for support? Well, one place you can go to is the NSEAD. And so they're absolutely brilliant. And let's have the next slide. And in here, there are various different versions and things that are going on in art education at that moment. There was on the back wall, there are some dinosaurs painted with a material that when you touch the paint, not only is it, it conducts electricity, but it can impede, it makes different sounds depending on how you program it. So you can kind of get this, because the paint is subject to, it kind of picks up the amount of pressure that you put on something. When you touch these dinosaurs with your finger, they barked like a dog. Let's go on to the next slide. This is me doing more advocacy. This is at London Metropolitan University, and this project was with this was trying to stop Old Flow, Henry Moore's sculpture, magnificent sculpture, being sold at auction. And we decided we'd do a flash mob, so we all dressed up as Old Flow. But this is when I realised the power of social media. I just got a phone with, I can't remember what it was now, Twitter, I suppose, on it. And I said, and I rigged it a bit. We had students from London Metropolitan University turning up dressed as Old Flow. But in the run-up to it, I was saying, I'm going to go to the charity shop today and buy my Old Flow green dress. And then I'm in the charity shop posting the image of me putting the dress on. Now I'm going to go to the accessories shop and buy my green tights. And so I did all this rigmarole. I'm heading to Tower Hamlets Station today. This is outside the council offices. Luther Rahman, I mean, I think it's fair to say, rather corrupt mayor of Tower Hamlets, he'd been persuaded, actually, to think about selling this sculpture, the Old Flow sculpture, because he had a 100 million gap in his local budget, and was persuaded that he would be able to get something approaching that for this sculpture of Old Flow. Henry Moore's sculptures are valuable, but they're not quite that valuable. So we would have lost this sculpture had it been sold. It had just gone off to some, museum in the Emirates or in Russia or somewhere, and we would have lost it in the public realm. Let's go on to the next slide. Yeah, no, I haven't got that many slides about Old Flow, but anyway. But anyway, the point about that is that when I turned up at the station, there were 20 people dressed as Old Flow, and they came and joined us in that protest. And it wasn't just me, of course, it was the Art Fund and a whole number of other institutions who were behind that campaign to save Old Flow, but Old Flow was saved. And so, in a way, that was amazing for me, because I've been in this campaign. Normally, if you're a sort of liberal, left-wing person, every campaign that I'd been on before that, we'd lost. But now I was doing this campaign, and actually, we won. So it kind of really was rather dangerous. So when Michael Gove came into power, which was in 2010, because of the pact between the Conservatives and the Liberal Party, it meant that any commitments, which there were commitments, not to muck about with education. In fact, the Tories' campaign in that election was to say, there's been a lot of changes in education, we're not going to make any more changes. That could all be usefully renegotiated because they had to come up with a new scheme. Neither of their manifesto pledges were relevant anymore because they had to come up with a coalition agreement. In that agreement, Michael Gove saw the opportunity to completely rejig the way in which schools were measured and governed. And, I think quite rightly in a way, he wanted to make sure that working class kids are not kind of patronised into, not studying maths and English. But in the state system, what happened was that the arts got really marginalised in a complicated system of governance. And it meant that for great head teachers, they could support the arts, but many art head teachers just saw the only way to promote their score in the various league tables was really to push maths and the sciences and English. And it's led to the diminution of languages and the arts and all the humanities. And that slide has carried on ever since. So I decided I would push back against Michael Gove and try and highlight this. I mean, I've talked a lot about all these campaigns. Of course, I might seem like a campaigner here, but I'm an artist, and I'm an artist that, a few people have heard of. When I was a child, Margaret Thatcher slashed the budget to the National Theatre. Peter Hall, who was the main person running the National Theatre, was on Nationwide virtually every evening, it seemed to me, really angry. But the arts establishment's way of dealing with Michael Gove was to say, we've got to deal with these people. I was on the board of the Tate at that time, and they quite quietly accepted a 25% cut in their funding, which meant there would be no mid-career shows of anybody. And they're probably still, I can't think of a big mid-career show of a living person that's happened in Tate Modern since that time. They thought, we've got to cope with it, we've got to deal with it. But I thought, well, fuck that, I think we need to speak about it. We need to say what's going on. We need to highlight it. And they said, well, you'll just be labelled, a kind of airy-fairy intellectual or something. But in a way, I felt we had to speak out about it. So anyway, in this moment, this is an actor playing Michael Gove coming up with the national curriculum in the bath in a film which I released with Home or Corner House in Manchester. Had national distribution, reviews in The Guardian. Let's have the next slide. And there's Michael Gove with his private secretary deciding to head up to something called the Art Party Conference. Next slide. We're going to take a bit of a detour here. This is a show that I made in Germany. And this, there's all sorts of funny undercurrents of work going on here. One is humour, which has kind of evaporated from my art over the past years. But that sign there, this was shown on the outskirts of Colditz in Leipzig. It says, imprisoned in Colditz, Nigel Gresley used to play the cornet to let off steam. Completely unintelligible to anybody here, certainly to people in Germany. Let's go on to the next slide. No artist can make a public sculpture more beautiful than a fly tip. Let's go on to the next slide. This then was the centerpiece of this art party in Scarborough. Scarborough important because Tom Hudson invented the foundation course there, and this letter I wrote. I actually wrote it back in 2011. I won't read it to you. It's widely available, but it's really in memory. I wrote it the weekend that Lucian Freud and Amy Winehouse died. And we'll come across Amy Winehouse later in this talk. But that letter, that painting, has hardly been in my studio since I painted it. It's been exhibited in France, it's been exhibited in Ireland, it's been up and down this country. A couple of artists decided that they wanted to walk it past Parliament. It's a very heavy painting. They took it apart in 2 sections and walked past Parliament in a march. So it's kind of become a thing. I originally wrote the letter and posted it to Michael Gove and thought, well, that's that. But it wasn't enough, But by making these texts into an object, I have to deal with them, and that makes them have a legacy and a journey, so they become a thing. Let's go on to the next slide. This is a rather self-aggrandizing image, but it's just to show that we had 2,000 art teachers and artists gather in Scarborough for this conference, where we had artists like Jeremy Dello and Cornelia Parker and Richard Wentworth and Haroon Mirza, Jeanette Paris, all talking about why art was important, why art education was important, and why we shouldn't diminish it in our standing in education. Let's have the next slide. And but after that, that was the 2015 election, and I hummed and hawed about this a lot, but I thought, if you really believe in what you're saying, Bob, you should stand against him in that election. And it was bit tricky. His constituency is in Camberley, which is almost literally diametrically opposed to Leytonstone, where I live in London. But I drove around the M25 in my camper van. I parked it up. I painted slogans from teachers who worked in Camberley on the side of the camper van during that election campaign. And I was able to sit down at hustings and say to the people in a hall like this, everybody wants their kid to study the violin, go on the stage, learn to sing, and be able to draw and design their future. And Michael, I would say, you are diminishing our capacity to do that in schools. And all these people, it's a very safe Conservative seat, I would say this, and they would cheer. They didn't really vote for me, thank God. But they would cheer. I would get people cheering, and he would go a bit red in the face. And that happened twice during that election campaign. And then on the night, of course, I was able to, let's have the next slide. Oh, I was able to stand in front of him and say that on the election night. But this is funny. I had a friend called Fedja Klichovic, who runs a gallery in London, and he had a load of my signs, and he just went up after the hustings and gave it to him, said, let's take a photograph of you with this. And he was like, oh, yeah, okay. So that's quite a funny picture of Michael Gove. Let's have the next slide. This is going off in a divergent thing, really, but thinking about language. Flags are all about gathering people underneath a banner, an idea. But these are flags on top of the festival hall. Let's have the next slide. Which are all trying to push some sort of neurosis. They're saying, you know, did you do art at school? Are you okay? They weren't all about art education. But it was just a nice project, the idea that you could kind of set a load of questions on a flag rather than provide a load of answers. Let's have another slide. This is in Ireland. Previous to all of this stuff about that coalition, we'd been through the Iraq War. I did a show in the Baltic where I had the whole, where the Labour Party had their spring conference, and they had to walk through the Baltic galleries where I'd painted a lot of paintings saying that various different members of the cabinet were, you know, short-sighted and blind, and Tony Blair was a warmonger and all these sorts of things. Anyway, one of them said Peter Hain is a shit, and this is on a bonfire. This is in Kilkenny. This is in the Kilkenny local parliament. So it was a project where I was invited to make an exhibition in the Kilkenny Festival across the whole of the festival in various different locations. So this is really the bonfire of all the unsold pieces of work in my studio. Let's have another image. This is a wonderful curator called Josephine Kelleher. This was another project in another kind of political situation, which seems so distant now, but it is interesting to think about. So in this moment, about 2017, Ireland was really hurting after the financial crash. All of Ireland is covered, probably still is to this day, in half-built housing projects when people thought, oh, the Celtic Tiger's going to happen, and Ireland is going to become this huge economy. And of course, Iceland collapsed, and Ireland then, that economy virtually collapsed. And Greece collapsed, and we had the Brexit vote, didn't we? But they voted to stay in the European Union. Josephine said, why don't we do a show thinking about why the Irish populace are so supine to Europe? Why are they not rioting in the streets? Because all the money's been taken away, and they've got the same deal for keeping their economy going that the Greeks have, whereas the Greeks were sitting in the middle of their squares in Athens protesting, whereas in Dublin that wasn't happening. So we made a show which was thinking about that, and in this piece, this is really inspired by Josephine, really. She was saying that in primary school you were given the talking stick, and only the child with the talking stick was able to talk. And she felt that Ireland had the talking stick removed. So we made these enormous tree trunk talking sticks and dumped them all around Kilkenny. And of course you couldn't lift them, and everybody was silent. Let's have the next slide. Art makes children powerful. That's the original sign for the Yorkshire Sculpture Park sign. Let's have the next one. This was a space where again, you got people involved. This was the argument centre where people could argue about things, and different groups of artists then were asked artists from Dublin and Kilkenny were asked to create their responses to the arguments that were going in the centre for argument, and they came up with all sorts of wonderful, magical, creative and positive documents which were charting all the arguments happening, and all the arguments were happening on this art soapbox. Let's have the next slide. There was an art school. So this was a previous version of the Folkestone as an art school, but in Kilkenny, if you like. Let's have the next space. So I run a band, the Apathy Band. And the Apathy Band, we played at Thamesmead recently. We create a kind of ambient cacophony, but we also play songs. We have a record out on Campus Records at the moment called Artists Ruin It for Everyone. This is, my wife is the singer, and we invite people to come and play with us. Jessie's singing or reading are these texts that I've been making over the years, and we invite different people to come and play with us. And weirdly, Graham Coxon was living in Ramsgate at that time, so Graham is playing the drums on that version. It was a really good gig. Let's have the next. It's good to have some musicians involved. This is a kiosk that was on Stratford Station during the Olympics. It's leaping a little bit back to 2012, but this is a key thing really for me. Really, the making of the film that you can see is on this kiosk. So let's go forward. So the film charts, you can recognise this wonderful actress is the same actress who played Michael Gove's private secretary. In this film, she plays the German theorist Hannah Arendt. And Hannah Arendt was just a brilliant person. She was Heidegger's girlfriend. Heidegger, in the 1920s, when in the rise of fascism, actually shopped her to the Nazis. She was Jewish, he wasn't Jewish. She was interviewed by the Gestapo. She moved to Paris, where she hung out with the Frankfurt School. They all had to, when France was invaded, they all had to leave. She was interred in a Jewish concentration camp, Camp Gurs. She managed to escape. Can you believe that? She managed to escape, and she got to the United States, and she became the first female professor, although she eschewed that term, but she at Princeton University. But her whole thing, she's famous for the phrase, the banality of evil, but her whole thing was trying to work out what happened in Germany, why the Nazis had been able to take over. Her conclusions were that democracy is best preserved by performance, by activity. It has to be enacted, and that kind of thinking has been, in a sense, the inspiration for a lot of my activities. You have a responsibility to not deny other people's points of views, but to put your point of view across, if you like. So in this film, she meets up with Pierre de Corbitan, the inventor of the modern Olympics. This is why it was an Olympic project. Pierre de Corbitan had much the same idea. He felt that everybody was going to, march through the gates of sport and talk to each other by having these sporting conflagrations rather than fight in a battle. And he came to that view because of the Franco-Prussian War and the Dreyfus case. So in my film, it was a London Underground project. They fall in love on the Central Line near Leytonstone in this great public space, the London Underground. So it was commissioned by London Underground, was in Stratford on that platform in Stratford Station all throughout the Olympics. Confusing everybody, I'm sure. I'm not sure how many people really got all these references. But the key thing is, in a way, it's like a Socratic idea, that everybody's views meet in the marketplace or in the public space and get discussed. And that's what they were both about. And in a way, that's what the Olympics was about. And that's what London Underground is about. And that's what Hannah Arendt thought democracy was defended by. Let's have the next slide. And then throughout that very familiar, if you go to Stratford International Station, you get out and you walk through this ticket hall. We had all these crazy paintings and images. The film was called Who is Community? It's still online. You can watch it. And all these moustache, Pierre de Corbitan's moustache was decorating that space. Let's go on to the next slide. This is a piece from 2008. It says, "Freedom. George Michael has done more for human rights than the Jam, the Clash, that bloke from the Boomtown Cats, and Bono and Sting all put together." Let's have the next slide. It's sort of true, because in my young life, George Michael was just pilloried by the press for going about his life in a way which now would seem quite unremarkable. So, in a way, I absolutely believe that. This piece is another true story. When I was a kid, I was obsessed with bohemians. I had long hair, I wore scarves, I had corduroy jackets with holes in, I had bohemian trousers and bohemian girlfriends. I used to hang out in Soho. I wanted to meet my heroes, Brendan Behan, Sylvia Plath, Ted Hughes, and that Welsh bloke who wrote Undermilt Wood. I never met anyone. I did meet Francis Bacon once. I said to him, "You don't look much like your self-portraits." He smiled and he gave me a £5. He said, "You won't get anywhere dressed like that. No one likes a scruff." The next slide. So this is me and Sadiq, and this is at the launch of the Borough of Culture, which has been just amazing, actually. Still rolls on, and they asked me to decorate this banner, and there was a launch for it. But the funny thing about that photograph is that Sadiq Khan is really about that high, and so I had to bend down. But anyway, it's not about the politics of Sadiq Khan, but it was an instance where if you're trying to force the agenda for the arts and you get somebody like that, it's good to try and, stick art all over them so they can't escape it. Let's have the next slide. Dear Donald, I have a radio show on Resonance FM. I have a big collection of spoken word records. I often play President Kennedy asking Americans to consider not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And Dr. King hoping that little black kids and little white kids will hold hands on the mountaintop. I have an LP of Adlai Stevenson saying all war is civil war and all killing is fratricide. These records memorialize inspirational words. Only someone with a warped sense of humor would distribute to future generations your utterances demeaning women and minority groups. Donald, the leader of the free world, cannot be an advocate for building walls, because with walls the world is not free. So let's have the next slide. This is Amy Winehouse, and on this sculpture, this is another sort of interpretive sculpture, but trying to say what Amy Winehouse was. Of course, we all know what she was. She was an amazing singer and songwriter, but there I write this story about how she was kind of Brendan Behan and Sylvia Plath, and she was all these iconic bohemians that I was trying to meet when I was a kid. Let's have the next slide. So this is a more poetic thing. This is thinking about text. A lot of what I actually do is sign writing, thinking about how we read text, how it is an image for ideas. And so this piece is thinking about, it's a personal thing, it's thinking about my mother who was stuck in a care home in York when I was in London during some floods in York a few years ago. It says the fumes are building, the radio is on, the soup is cooling, the train is passing, the town is flooding, the phone is ringing. Let's have the next slide. This is at MoMA PS1, and we did a project asking people to, they could have a show, anybody could have a show at MoMA PS1, so they could have MoMA on their CV. You know, I mean, that's a big thing, isn't it? You're all artists. You'd want to have MoMA on your CV, MoMA in New York. But you could only have that if you signed away your artwork so that it could go to landfill after the exhibition. So all the work that was made in PS1 then ended up in these dumpsters. Let's have the next slide. And it was funny because I was invited to do it in the midst of all this art advocacy stuff, and the curator said, well, I really love the stuff where you throw art away. I was going, well, I don't do that anymore. I'm trying to promote the idea of creativity. But the idea in this was that we would have a space where, you know, people could make art. So the actual point about it was to inflect the idea and reverse it so that we'd have a making space and all this work could be made. But the document that we had, where people had to sign over their work to Museum of Modern Art, Museum of Modern Art had to have ownership of it before we could throw it away, was a conceptual work of art in its own sense. When I got to New York, I had no work. This is about halfway through the exhibition. So the whole thing was about a bit like growing a garden, really. We were filling this space with work. Let's have the next slide. At the opening, I thought, let's invite Mr. T. And Mr. T, the actor, turned up. It was absolutely brilliant. And actually, what was really moving is because I gave a talk about the ideas behind it afterwards, and the actor was just so fantastic. He was, he was going, oh God, I wish the art teachers at school taught me to taught all this stuff. But in the exhibition, I had this sign saying, children's art is wonderful, painted on a big piece of polystyrene. And he came and he smashed his way through it and went, children's art is bad. and the whole crowd were going, no, Mr. T, no, don't smash up children's art. It's bad, it's bad, it's bad. And anyway, it was all kind of quite comic and theatrical. And then we had a moment where we asked everybody to pick up the polystyrene and bring it up into the gallery and carefully place it on this plinth that was already sort of set up for it. And then Mr. T picked me up. But it was great. It was great fun, and all the kids there really loved it. It was really surprising to see Mr. T. Let's have the next slide. This is a piece in Belfast, and this is a piece, it says, what unites human beings, ears, eyes, toes, hopes, fears, it is huge and wonderful. What divides human beings is small and mean. It was a piece commissioned by 1418 now, at that moment when the First World War kicked off, if you like. It was to commemorate that moment. In Belfast, it's a very contested territory because all the Protestants in Belfast were slaughtered in the Battle of the Somme. They were the first regiments to go in. Catholics in Belfast, in Northern Ireland, are not commemorated. So it's tough to think about. And they said, well, do you want to do this? And I was going, well, I don't have any connection with Ireland. They said, you're called Patrick. Well, that's to do with my Irish ancestry on my father's side, but it's very, I don't have any root into it. But we worked with community groups. Each community group got a different letter to decorate, if you like. And the community groups were the Sikhs, the Muslims, the LGBT community, the women's groups, all the different groups, including the Protestants and the Catholic groups in different churches. They all made and decorated a letter, part of this slogan. We lit the candles in this piece, and I thought, oh God, this is a really terrible piece of community art. But what was amazing was the conversations that were had afterwards. There was nowhere to go, and we just all stood there talking about what this slogan, this idea about what unites us, being positive, might mean. And it was heartbreaking and powerful stuff. Let's have the next slide. That's it being lit and some of the people hanging around afterwards. Let's have the next slide. This is in Bologna, a march at the Museum of Modern Art in Bologna. Again, we've had a bit of an Apathy Band. We've had an Apathy marching band of local musicians, technicians who work in the gallery, marched around the gallery with these banners saying Arti per tutti, and then created a kind of spectacle and then sat them inside. Let's have the next slide. So we're coming to the end of the slides now, but these are all artists and writers, journalists who had been disappeared. I worked with Index on Censorship, and I said, look, I'll do something with you. And they said, well, can you paint a list of these 24 people? We're going to, on the 24th of November, we're going to go to all the different embassies in London, and we'll take the list and we'll take photographs and use it as a social media effort to go to the Mexican embassy, to go to the Saudi embassy, to go to the Pakistani embassy, to go to, to go around all these embassies, and we'll have these people, these artists who are no longer free to speak, and we'll be highlighting their dilemma. Let's have the next slide. That then pushed me into a different territory. It kind of gave me it wasn't in any sense a kind of breakdown, but it pushed me into a different kind of area with work, really. I've been quite light-hearted and humorous about making work, but suddenly at that point it all became a bit more serious. And at that time also there was broadcast an amazing interview with this doctor, surgeon David Knott on the radio, which happened in a long-form interview over, I think it was the winter of 2014, and with Eddie Mair, and he described working in, plying his trade in Aleppo, where the town was divided really, and they were all shooting at each other. But during the interview, he describes the theatre that he worked in. He's describing how primitive it is, really, because in Syria their surgical equipment is, sort of circa 1973, and so if you've got to find a bullet in any part of the body, you've got to use implements which are, you're not familiar with, and you don't have the kit. And then there's a man, and in this description he says there's a man that comes in at the end of every surgery with a big brush and just sweeps out all the blood. At that point, Eddie Mair couldn't carry on. He was interviewing, but it was such a powerful interview. David Knott is such a fantastic speaker in a way, a fantastic human being, that it ground to a halt and there was silence on Radio 4. And I was listening to this interview and I thought, oh my God, this is just like a landmark piece of broadcasting. I want to transcribe it. So I sat down with a recording of the interview and listened to it and transcribed it and began to paint it. It took me 3 months, but I was able to do it, and we exhibited it at the Royal Academy. And you can see the gap there in the middle is the moment where it became too much for Eddie Mair. Let's have the next slide. And then you can see, there's a big Conrad Shawcross here, but there's that painting in the background. You see the scale of it. And then Eddie and because it was going to be in the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition, they got to hear about it. I didn't particularly promote it to them, but they did hear about it. So they came and did another piece for PM about revealing it. And the point about it really was to try and raise money for David Knott's foundation. This is linking back to Help Art Save Lives, really. I'm still trying to sell that painting. It's enormous. Nobody really wants an enormous painting, which makes you burst into tears halfway through. It's a powerful thing, but it's a lot to take on. The following year, I made prints of it, and I sold a lot of them. I didn't sell out the edition, but I sold a lot of them. I was able to give that money to the David Knott Foundation. And in that moment, I suddenly realized, well, you can do something, you can do something intellectually, you can advocate for things, but you can actually do something with art. You can raise some money. And that's what I did for the David Knott Foundation in that moment. And I thought, well, I'm going to carry on doing that. So that's why I'm pushing this Help Art Save Lives idea at the moment. Let's go on to the next slide. What was amazing about it was when you went into that room, how many people actually stood and read the whole of the text. Not everybody. Of course, the dwell time for artworks in a gallery is 7 seconds, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know if there are any painters here. I don't know if that depresses you or puts you off. You've got 7 seconds. But it takes 21 minutes to read that, really. And there were people standing there reading the whole text, partly because they remembered the interview. It's quite a famous interview. Let's have the next slide. I'm going to whiz through these a little bit. It's repeating some of the ideas, but the following year I made a documentary for BBC 4, which was about art and protest. One of the people I interviewed was this woman, Blair Marnie. This all gets a bit emotional, but let's go on to the next slide. That's the Apathy Band at the Hull School of Art and Design. Along the top of it, you can see a sign that says, "This is a Freedom of Expression Centre." Let's have the next slide. So that's me and Blair Marnie. Let's have the next slide. And that's Blair Marnie, the sax player from the Apathy Band, whose heritage is from Barbados, has just played a sax solo. And we've reenacted an interview that I conducted with her for BBC 4. When we did the filming, when I interviewed her, we were in a park in New York, and we sat down, and she had just come back from this experience that she recounted, which was traveling from New York to Baton Rouge to hold a vigil for Alton Sterling. Some of you will remember an appalling video taken by Alton Sterling's girlfriend of Alton Sterling being shot in a car while he reaches for his keys, and that film went viral. Blair travelled down to hold this vigil for Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge, right in the south, in Louisiana, and there she was rounded up, peaceful protest. She was rounded up and imprisoned overnight. She was rounded up with white women who had gone to the protest to atone for their parents' actions at Selma. So their parents had gone to Selma to spit at Martin Luther King. And these women who turned up for this protest were embarrassed and shocked by, grown up with these racist parents, had gone to this protest, and they had been rounded up. Blair Marnie was only 19 when this happened, and they supported her in the jail. That night in the jail, there were two shootings of two policemen in Louisiana. One was a black police officer and one was a white police officer. On release, Blair Marnie then held a vigil for the policemen after they had mistreated her by imprisoning her. They tied her hands in cuffs, with plastic cuffs, and her hands filled with blood. But she held this vigil, and then the policemen, some of the policemen who had been involved in her arrest, contacted her and apologized to her. So she tells this story to me. But when you do a film for the BBC, what they do is they give you the transcript and they edit it. The editor edits the bits of writing, and then they give you the bit of film that is the bit of writing, and then that's put into the film. But I was given this fantastic transcript, and I thought, well, that made a great painting, So I made that painting. We exhibited at Hull City of Culture. Hull City of Culture is where Wilberforce comes from, and the abolitionist. And Blair, we managed to get money from Hull City of Culture to get Blair to come over from New York with her family, and we reenacted the interview. And when we did that, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. It's a very powerful thing. Let's have the next slide. So that's the painting. Again, like a long painting. Let's have the next slide. And there were these paintings on doors in there. We've only got each other. There's still art, there's still hope. Let's have the next slide. Then this is coming to more sort of art school kind of activities. This is a gallery that I show within Basel with some slogans. Let's have the next slide. By this time, the Art Makes Children Powerful sign had begun to rot and fall apart, so they commissioned me to do a new one. So I painted, still there to this day, all schools should be art schools. Let's go to the next slide. And here we are, ladies and gentlemen. This is Folkestone is an art school, as it was back in 2017, with art. You know, you can see, you've seen, you know, the museum MoMA plastered in drawings. In a way, it was kind of trying to create this space, and actually in the gallery in Preston that we've just done, we wanted to create a gallery. I mean, one of my key things is, you know, all schools should be art schools. Well, all art galleries should bloody well be art schools. You don't go, you know, you shouldn't go to a gallery solely to see art made by other people. You should go to a gallery to see a living enterprise. And that's what was so marvellous about this commission. It was that the actual commission wasn't part of a learning program. It wasn't a separate, it wasn't an adjunct. It was my work in the Triennial. Let's have the next slide. Banners around that very familiar edifice. Let's have the next slide. The station. Let's have the next slide. And then these are some of the workshops. We can see Ollie here. Look, there's Ollie. Let's have the next slide. And the idea was to get the town to teach itself art. For Christ's sake, you know, if it's meant to be a creative space, there must be some creative people here who can teach. and that's what it was about, really. It was about saying, you know, art's a conversation, and we can all be involved in that conversation. Thank you. Another long talk.
Thank you. I'm just going to share your mic for a second.
Yeah.
Are we allowed to have, can we have the lights up for the audience? It's quite weird, we can't see you at all. I'd just like to say thank you, Bob.
I know.
For that fantastic kind of overview of your work and how it came to Folkestone.
It's just a rant, isn't it?
No. So the next part involved you that I can't see, and whether you'd like to ask Bob and Roberta any questions. We are incredibly lucky today. So my kind of experience with Folkestone as an art school was that I was one of the project managers back in 2017, so I kind of looked after the staff and students.
You actually did it, I didn't do it.
Well, you were there. But tonight we have two of the students who went through Folkestone as an art school in the room as well, which is quite phenomenal.
Can you stand up?
So Ollie is actually working at the Quarterhouse tonight.
Ollie, big round of applause for Ollie.
And Sophie is over there in the darkness. But if we have to take this. So what was really brilliant about I'm going to stop talking and ask you to ask questions. But what was really brilliant about that Triennial artwork is things that really did happen. So for Ollie, I'm going to introduce him very briefly. Is that he came from not an art background. He did the Folkestone as an art school. Was also won through Screen South a kind of an animation supported workshop. And after going through Screen South, had one of his almost shown on Channel 4 for Random Acts and got accepted into university to do an animation degree. So that was quite a phenomenal thing. Sophie over here will be finishing a textiles degree next year and went on to do a foundation course in Canterbury. So it's the foundation courses that Folkestone as an art school was a mini foundation course, really. So there's been a really kind of long-term impact that we're still not seeing the full kind of consequences of yet. So for me in particular, it is brilliant that you guys are here, but I would like to open up to the audience. Ollie has got the mic, and it's a roving mic, so if anyone would like to ask a question to Bob about Folkestone as an art school or any of the artworks that you've seen in particular, that would be very welcome. Let's go quiet.
Oh, got one over there.
Thank you. Do you want me to bring the mic over? Or would you like a chair? I can lower it if you want.
No, that's
I'll get out the way.
Yeah, no.
Backed on. Oh, I'm back. Okay, I'll stop shouting. So I'd just love to hear a little bit more about your time in Folkestone, maybe thinking back to when you came here in 2017, and just hear a bit more about what you think the impact of artworks can be on a place, as well as sort of the art education, the impact that it can have on a place or a town like Folkestone. What has been your experience of how the artworks can impact the making of a place or the way that a place changes over time?
I don't know. I mean, obviously I'm very pro Folkestone as an arts, the Folkestone Triennial. It's great, but I mean, I think art is public art is making sculptures in public is fraught with difficulty. There's going to be a show. There's going to be a program, actually on Sky Arts, I think this month, where lots of different artists have been invited to go to Liverpool. Liverpool has I'm afraid it has more sculpture in it than even Folkestone. It has lots and lots of sculptures, and lots of them date from commissioning ideas about sculpture which we probably wouldn't support now, but they've invited lots of artists to playfully, muck about with them. So I've made a big banner, very, supportive kind of banner about a sculpture made by Jacob Epstein there. But then another artist that during the summer I went up to Liverpool, made a brilliant piece of work where he dressed Disraeli as an incredible dandy, Daniel Lismore, and he dressed him as a dandy because Disraeli, was a gay man, and so he's kind of outed Disraeli, whereas this sculpture, when it was conceived, wasn't about Disraeli as a kind of LGBTQ dandy. So I think lots of pragmatic things about sculpture. I don't think it's good of itself to stick sculpture everywhere. I think lots of things about it. I think, you can think about certain kinds of sculpture, even contemporary sculpture, as a tomcat running around the town, marking the territory. It can be not necessarily a beneficial thing. But I think what's very nice about the projects in Folkestone is that they have a sense of being not particularly grandiose. The best one, actually, I saw today was A.K. Dolvin's, which is perhaps the most grandiose, which was this amazing bell, That's an amazing thing, that sculpture. I hope that is there forever and a day. But, these sculpture, like all of us, comes and it goes, and it's wonderful to think about the things that will be loved will be retained and the things that people don't love will disappear. The sculpture of Old Flow that I talked about there was very important because Old Flow was Henry Moore's Guernica. We know Henry Moore loved Picasso, and it's really Henry Moore's Guernica. The drawings for that are his war artist drawings, where he was drawing in the tubes. These amazing drawings of these families sheltering from the bombs in the Blitz, and he conceived that sculpture as a sculpture for UNESCO in Paris. Actually, it wasn't accepted as that, but he created it for the UN essentially. So it's an image of a woman sheltering from the Nazis. Just like the woman sheltering from the Nazi bombs in Guernica. So it's a powerful thing. So I'm very pro the story of sculpture and public art, but it has other underbellies. The tearing down of that Corbitan statue in Bristol, that was a remarkable act of freedom of expression. My God, how awful for communities of people from the Caribbean to go to Corbitan Hall and walk past that statue of Corbitan. So it's a nuanced and rich debate.
I think coming back to your idea of people enacting, so the power of, it's not how people are kind of activated in the town as well is important in your work, or how people are brought, not to do a particular thing, but given like the leaping pad to go on.
Well, you know, I think as an artist, you know, I think about art as something I do. I mean, I think about, this is why I'm thinking about the idea of the gallery being an art school. I think of it as something I do. You know, this morning I was in the studio making art, you know, and I will be tomorrow, and well, I'll be teaching it tomorrow, but on Friday I'll be making art again. You know, it's something that people do. But principally, if we don't think of ourselves as an artist, you're told that it's something to look at, to appreciate. You know, I'm not. Of course, I look at art. I love going to galleries. I love looking at people who can do things better than I can, who can do things, have done extraordinary things in the past. But for me, when I look at it, I look for ideas I can steal and techniques that I could learn to do better. I look at it for my purposes as somebody who does something, and that's what I think is Arendtian about it, if you like, you know, the activity of it. So I don't think people should come to Folkestone to see things made by other people which are marvellous. I think they should think of, well, I'd like to do something a bit better than that.
There's a hand up there.
To me, listening to you tonight and just reflecting on this triennial and previous triennials, a significant, important part of art to me is people. The influence of people, the impact of people on art, and the continuing narrative that generates. People get together, people talk, people exchange ideas. Would you say people was quite high on your list of influences in the art that you produce, and their stories?
No, I'm absolutely. I'm absolutely a kind of humanist in that sense. No, you know, I'm making all these things, but it's totally about people. It's about the groups of people. It's about you lot turning up here tonight. It's about the students who went to the art school, the people who perhaps weren't the students who went to the art school, who just made things, the parents encouraging their children to make art. If you want your child to make art, the best way to get them to think about it is to make a drawing of them, yourself, and then they'll see you doing it, and they'll go, what are you doing? And they'll go, well, I'm making a drawing of you. And that means that they will then make a drawing of their children. And it's, you know, it's why we have families of doctors and, you know, architects or whatever it is. You know, it's seeing we're very imitative beings. It's not the only, it doesn't mean that people who don't have art in their lives can't be artists, but we are quite imitative beings. It's part of what learning is. And it's part of what human society is all about. And so this thing that happens with creativity, and in my area, you know, I've talked a lot about art because that's what I kind of know about. But what I'm trying to say is, you know, what I'm trying to do is, it's all for people. You know, when you've got David Knott, you know, he's not, he's not sticking people back together for some. I mean, of course, he's an incredible humanitarian, but he's not doing it for his own purposes. You know, he's doing it for them. That's what it's about. And that is, I mean, it's not that I'm doing it for you, but I'm trying to encourage people to make their own damn art. But you know, it is that interchange, dialogue, working in a lot of these things, like with you, Liv. You know, it's working as an ensemble activity to try, not to achieve something, but to try and throw a pebble into a pond, which you hope might have some evidence of there being a ripple occasionally.
That's a good way of explaining it. Is there any other hands up?
Hello. Thank you for this evening. I guess I really liked the simplicity, but how powerful some of the statements or the slogans were. And I was just wondering, I mean, it felt special for me being here tonight, but some of the communities and people you work with, they must be even more special. And I'm wondering how you've seen either institutions or individuals kind of take ownership of those statements and how they've kind of rippled out across other people's work, really.
Well, that's a great question. I should have planted that. Because one of the things I think about the Thamesmead piece, where I've interviewed all these different people on the Thamesmead estate. The Thamesmead estate is a bit of a disaster zone, really, if you think about it. It was a utopian idea to build a community, really, on the site of. If you think of where Belmarsh Prison is, and you've read Great Expectations, Belmarsh Prison is the hulks of which a Magwitch escapes in Great Expectations. It's a place of conflict. It's a polluted place where where they made bombs and munitions for the First and Second World War, and they built Kubrick saw all of that actually when he created The Clockwork Orange. It's a complex place, and you interview people. Some of them love it, some of them hate it, some of them are glad to be there, some of them just want to escape. But you just want to have these conversations to talk about, not about the issues about Thamesmead, it's about these individual people's stories, if you like. You don't really have to think about Thamesmead, it tells its own story. But one of the things, that was a collaboration with Tate Modern. And when I was doing that project, I think that's not breaking any confidences to say, we did it with Peabody, who were the housing trust who are charged with regenerating Thamesmead in a way. But Tate Modern they asked me to do it, but they were a bit kind of dragging their feet slightly during the whole process. And to be fair to them, I made it a much bigger project than I think they originally conceived of. But the point was to be a Trojan horse, to drag all those voices and stick them in Tate Modern, because the voices of modernism, generally when you read an interpretive panel in Tate Modern, it says, so-and-so came from a wealthy family, they weren't really understood, they went off to Paris and they made this extraordinary minimalist statements. Well, I absolutely love all that. But it's not the art and languages and the stories of a wide society of human beings. So what I wanted to do with that piece is to drag it into Tate Modern as a Trojan horse effort to stick all those images up there, and how brilliant that Joshua, had his painting there, but then, it's a bit of an effort to try and promote a particular individual, but those in January, those paintings they came through in the end, Tate Modern, so they're going to be exhibited, and that whole painting will be in Tate Modern in January. But it is that, really, the success of that piece is just a first step in the stone of dismantling Tate Modern and calling it something else. In fact, we should get rid of Tate for a start, because Turner, who donated his art to Tate after his death, was an abolitionist. There's no way he would have given his art to a gallery that's named after a sugar magnate who reinvigorated the sugar trade with indentured labour after the abolition of slavery. No way would Turner have done that. All Turner's art was actually deeply subversive. He painted pictures of people going over the battlefield in 1815, stealing from the dead bodies. It wasn't the image of the Battle of Waterloo that Wellington would have enjoyed. So, anyway, all these things, artists are deeply subversive people, and that's why countries lock them up. But we need to get in this country, we need to get everybody thinking that they can have a go at that.
Thank you. I think that's probably a good place to stop, to encourage all of us to have a go. Good. But no, once again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for putting up with me.